Well, Heidi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm glad that we could finally sit down and have this conversation. I know we had kind of spoke via LinkedIn, and we've had the
Mhm.
privilege of working together as well, which we'll kind of get into as we talk.
Yep.
So I always like to start with get to know you type questions, just kind of get to know the guest. And of course, the listeners have no idea who you are. So let's
Yep.
start real easy.
Yep.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee for sure.
That's the right answer. Any favorite type of coffee? It doesn't have to be a brand.
No, I wouldn't say any favorite type, just a lot of sugar to even further caffeinating.
Really? Now, creamer
Yeah.
as well, or just sugar?
Um, so creamer and then not actual sugar, but sugared flavoring, like syrup.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's
as
the
unhealthy as you can make it, I'll drink it.
hey, well, it still has the caffeine, and that's the important part.
Exactly. That's all I care about.
Do you have a favorite place to have that drink of coffee?
Um, as much as I would love for it to be on the couch watching TV in the morning, it's usually drive-through coffee, driving either the kids to school, driving to work, wherever. It's usually in the car.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think that's the reality of life for many of us.
Yep.
Even
Even
though,
even with the virtual working from home, it still somehow is in the car every morning. So
isn't that crazy?
yeah.
I have yet to figure out how we're still driving all over the place when most of the people are, fortunately or unfortunately, able to work from Zoom these days.
Yeah. Pretty much everything I do is virtual now. So
It's
except for
crazy.
coffee, I guess. So coffee's still in the car.
Well, there you go. Do you have a best or worst travel story?
I definitely have a worse one. I was flying out to Texas actually for the first residency of my dissertation. And I'm traveling with my mom and my oldest daughter, which at the time she was only 2, if maybe not even 2. So we're we're going through the security check with TIA, and they're going through all the luggage, and they pull me aside, and I'm already frustrated because traveling with an almost 2-year-old, I feel like that's goes without saying.
Yes.
But so I'm already frustrated. I'm like, oh, my bag, like, and I was like, there's nothing in it. And I thought they were gonna stop me for having formula in there, or it wasn't formula, but I think it was like a cooler milk or something like that for my daughter. And I was like, it's a baby bottle, like she has to have it. And I'm like, super annoyed. And they're like, you have a pocket knife in your bag in your carry-on. And I was like, no. And I felt so embarrassed because obviously I already was throwing a fit about the fact that they pulled me over. They're like, you have a knife. So I was like, oh my gosh, please. Like, I'm so sorry. I forgot that was in there. Like, I use this bag for a bunch of different things. They were like, yeah, okay. So they had to pull me aside. My mom and my daughter had to keep going. I had to get pulled aside. I had to do the whole 9 with, like getting checked. All my bags, the bag that I checked had to get taken out and it was a mess. We barely made the flight by, I think, 3 minutes. We had to sprint across the airport, which of course my daughter doesn't understand, right? Like she doesn't want to run. So I'm like potato sack carrying her through the airport. It was a mess. I don't know how I didn't get stopped for like kidnapping a child because I was literally running with my daughter under one arm
Right.
and my bag on the other. So
That's a great story, actually. In
yeah.
fact, that's probably one of the best ones I've heard to date. And one of my greatest fears, because being in law enforcement, and for those
Mhm.
of us in law enforcement and law enforcement related careers,
Mhm.
that's my biggest fear is having something in the same bags that I carry everything. I mean, sometimes other weapons and so forth. And it's
Yeah.
like, before I go on a trip, it's like checking every little pocket and every little thing on there.
Yeah, because you never know. And speaking of that, I didn't even that was so traumatic that I didn't even think of when I had to travel with my canine for when I was at the sheriff's office. And I'm sure you've seen that canine. He's a nut. And we actually had to give him Benadryl to chill him out, and he still was all over the place. And for people that don't know, typically when you travel with your canines, they sit with you on the plane. Like they don't go underneath the plane or anything. They sit with you. And it's not like a lap dog. So my 50-something pound lab is sitting in between my legs in coach, right? Like we're not like fancying it first class. So
Right.
sitting in coach, his tail is hitting the guy in front of me. And the guy, I can tell the guy's like annoyed because for 3 hours to Colorado, he's just getting hit with a tail. And then the dog is trying to like go underneath the seat to get the snacks that the little kids behind me were dropping. Oh, but still that doesn't top the having to run across the airport because I brought a knife with me. So
I don't know. That's a pretty good story as well. How many times
yeah.
did you fly with the canine?
2. I flew twice with him, but on those flights, they were connecting flights. So we had to fly, get off, wait in the airport, just waiting for an hour with the dog, then reboard and fly again. And it was like that both ways. And then I also drove all the way to Ohio with him.
Oh, wow. That would have been quite a trip as well.
Mhm.
So, for the listeners, because they obviously don't know you, let's talk a little, let's just segue right there into a little bit of your experience. What is
Okay.
your professional experience?
So professionally, I would say so. I, up until recently, I guess I was a career student because I've been in school for so long. But I really mostly in high school and even in college, I worked in the legal setting. So I was a paralegal for a long time, or in the beginning a law clerk, and then worked my way up to paralegal. I worked in offices with criminal law, family law, civil litigation, property law, rezoning, land development law, really anything. I was in and out. And I was fortunate enough that I was the paralegal that went to trial with these attorneys and did kind of like their case prep and sat in on a lot. So that really helped me when I transitioned over to the sheriff's office, because I had a lot of court experience just observing. So then I went to the sheriff's office in 2016, where I became a forensic investigator and did that for a while. I got my international certification in crime scene. I was an FTO, kind of served as a leadership role there for a long time. And then my last almost 2 years, I guess a year and a half there, I became a human remains detection or HRD canine handler, which was something very unique. We haven't really seen that a whole lot in the sheriff's office setting with forensic investigators. To our knowledge, there wasn't one anywhere else that had a canine paired with a forensic investigator. So it was kind of something new we were doing. It came with a lot of trial and error, but it was definitely one of the most rewarding and fun aspects of my career by far. Which I can't believe on travel stories, I didn't talk about. I think I was just thinking plane. I didn't even think about when we drove to the Everglades and he got bit by a water moccasin, because that was a crazy travel story.
Well, and
But
that's where I was going to go next because I wanted you to introduce what type of dog you had. So
yeah.
I would love to hear that story. I'm sure the listeners would as well.
Yeah, so we were on a case with the FBI at the time, at least in Florida, a pretty high profile case involving an Amber Alert. Pasco actually had the case anyways, at least part of the case, because the abductor was found dead in Pasco County. So I had worked that scene, and then as I was there, I was like, hey, have we found the baby? Like, I have my dog. Do we need to search for the baby? So then I deployed on scene. We didn't find anything other than the guy that was already dead there. And then FBI got involved. We talked with them. They wanted us to come down to the Everglades to continue searching for the child. So we went down once, searched for about 6 hours, and then drove back. And then a week later, they called us again and said, hey, we have another tip. Can you come down? And at that point, we were really vetting any and all tips. It was probably every other day I was working on that case, whether it be up in Pasco, in Hernando. We went to the Hernando dump along the side of the road, off 19 and off the interstate on 75. So we were kind of all over the place. So then we go down to the Everglades again, get up early. It's like almost a 4 or 5 hour drive down there. We get to where we need to go. We get out of the car and they point us to where they wanted us to search. And at that point, there was just myself and one other canine handler there. We were the only canine team searching though at that time. So I deployed, and since I was a forensic investigator, I'm not armed. And really in the Everglades, we're not worried about people coming up on us, but alligators, I would probably rather a person come up on me. But
Right.
so my trainer was with me. We go into the woods. We're approximately 20 feet off the roadway into this thick vegetation. And all of a sudden, the dog starts limping. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. We just got here, 5 hour drive. And I was like, it better just be a sand spur. So I was like, he's okay. And then eventually he started limping to where he wasn't even putting any pressure on the leg. The leg was all the way retracted up. And he's really like, I mean, he's crazy. So he was still running, but I could really tell something was wrong. So I get up to him. I have him on a 30-foot leash. I finally get up to him and he's bleeding. And I was like, oh, he had to have stepped on something, maybe like broken glass or a thorn or something like that. So I'm like, I'm going to take him back to the car, figure out what it is, wash it out, and we'll go again. So I walk him. As I'm walking back to the car, all of a sudden, my trainer starts screaming and he yells, "Don't move! Don't move! Don't move!" I'm like, what? And then he pulls out his gun, and I'm like, what's happening? And I'm just sitting here with the dog. We're maybe like 10 feet apart, and the grass is so high I can't see what he's looking at. And he's like, I'm gonna have to shoot it. I'm gonna have to shoot it. And he yells to the road to all the FBI guys, like, hey, I'm about to fire. I still have no idea because he won't tell me. I'm like,
Right.
what's going on? And I'm scared that it's a gator, and like my dog is so low to the ground, so I like pick him up. And he's like, it's a water moccasin. So he shoots it. And then at that point, we looked at each other and we realized what had happened, that's why he was limping. And, we look at each other and we kind of do that like, oh crap moment, because we're in the middle of nowhere. So he's like, get into the car. He's screaming, I'm running. I get him over there and I look and his foot isn't swollen yet. Some other people are like, oh, it was probably just a thorn. I was like, no, there's no way. It's not that much of a coincidence that the water moccasin was like up with his mouth open, ready to strike again. So I was like, we're taking him just in case. Like, I'm not taking any chances. We're taking him. So the closest vet was 40 miles away. They had talked about like bringing in a helicopter to take him to get anti-venom. And I'm like, so meanwhile, we had only been there 20 minutes at this point. We get him in the car. We realize it's only 40 miles away, lights and sirens in a county we don't even belong in. And we book it to the nearest vet. And so my trainer's driving, I'm in the passenger seat, like turn around, gripping the cage. And I'm just watching him the whole time. And I'm like, his foot's turning blue, his foot's turning purple, his foot's turning black, it's swelling, it's triple its size. I think he passed out. And so by the time we get to the vet, I yank him out of the car, I throw him over my shoulder, I sprint in. And we were like, hey, if there's any way we can just like get him stable, we'll transport him to a Blue Pearl vet up by us. And they were like, all right, we'll let you know. So we drop him off. I have like my mini meltdown, right? I'm only like a couple months post giving birth. So I'm still like, hormonal. So the vet calls and they're like, yeah, there's no way you can transport him. We already had to give him 2 doses of anti-venom, which is way more than any animal should really get. And they're like, you just need to be prepared. And I mean, I've had animals, and anyone that has animals know that when the vet tells you to be prepared, your dog's about to die. So I was like, oh, okay. So they're like, you're gonna have to stay the night. We don't have any clothes. I didn't have a toothbrush. Like, we had to go and find a hotel. So we go and find a hotel, and then we had to go to Walmart, and I had to buy clothes. I had to buy a toothbrush, hair, like a whole bunch of stuff. So then we finally the next day go and get him, and we had to like outfit the back of the truck to make it sterile and get him back home. It was a mess.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Wow,
But
that's quite the story. Now, a couple things listeners probably don't understand. First of all, obviously, it's an animal, it's a dog. You develop a bond with that dog. You don't want to lose them. But there's another side of it too. Canines and agency dogs have a lot of cost in training hours, and there's a value there as well. That's a huge loss as well, correct?
Oh yeah, because it's not just, and a lot of people think it's just like the initial cost of the dog, but it's not. It's the cost of the dog, which in general is expensive, right? Because I think the majority are all, like purebred, whatever they are, right? Whether it be Lab or Malinois or German Shepherds, they come from elite breeders. So right there, you have a pretty big penny that you're investing. Then it's the training that you put into them, and whether you outsource them to get trained or whether you yourself train them, it's it's either monetarily or investment of your time put in there. And then it's all the food, all the supplies, and then the trainings that you have to go to. Some of our canine trainings were almost $1,000 just for a couple days seminar. So that is a big loss as well. So it's the amount of time that you put into them, the cost that is associated with upkeep of them, and with just purchasing them. Yeah, it's a lot. So it's both the emotional and financial sides of it, and logistics. So that was like one of the only dogs we had. So if God forbid anything happened, or even if he got retired because of medical issues, now we have no dog. And now it's going to be a timely manner before we can get one bought, trained, and ready to certify and deploy.
Right.
Yeah.
So the end of that story, did he do just fine and recover fully?
The end of that story. So he was fine. We went to the vet every other day for about 2 months.
Wow.
Which was a 45-minute drive from where we live. So, and at that time I worked nights, and even though it was a 24-hour vet, they had to have a certain vet assess him every day. So I would get off work at 2 a.m. I would drive my 45 minutes to where he had to go. And I would drop him off for the night. So he would stay at little doggy daycare overnight and then go for his appointment. And then I would wake up early the next day and I would go get him. So we did that for 2 months, every other day.
Wow.
But he's fully recovered now and still working. So
it's good to hear. Good to hear. And listeners will love that. Just a quick side note on that. You mentioned it was a cadaver dog. So obviously they're used to find human remains, presumably.
They are.
And the dogs differentiate between human remains and other remains, or?
They can, yeah. So I actually just taught this in my class last week. Yes, so they can. And that's a common misconception that people think, because people that aren't in the field, they think decomp is decomp, dead body is dead body, like they all smell. But even though, sometimes us as humans can tell that they smell different. For me, I can go on a scene, if someone's like, I think there's a dead body, I can pretty much with pretty high certainty be like, no, that's an animal, just from experience. But the reason why they smell different is because they have different volatile organic compounds, which humans have like around 408, a little over 400, and animals have over 800. So, which is like, it's theorized in a lot of different academic journals that that's why they smell worse and different. But dogs can actually detect that. Dogs' noses are obviously much more advanced than ours and much more sophisticated. So they can actually differentiate between the two of those, which allows them, when they come into contact with different remains, if it's animal, based on their training, they can be like, oh no, that's not it. And then they can continue forward until they find the human remains.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
I've had another forensic investigator on this show, and she was out of California, and she was in a certified position out there. So is it my understanding that some agencies do have certified forensics and so forth? Your experience, though, was not on the certified law enforcement side of the house. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. Mine was civilian. In Florida, majority are civilian. What you see is a lot out west, which makes sense in California, and in northern states, most of them are certified. And I think that kind of aligns with like the kill two birds with one stone mantra, because when, for those that don't know, when you're a civilian forensic investigator, you typically aren't on scene by yourself. Even if you're not, even if you feel comfortable being on scene by yourself, typically in some sort of general order or SOP, it's going to be mandated that they stay on scene with you, mostly for protection, because I have a flashlight, you know what I mean? So, so for safety, they typically stay on scene with you.
And clearly a pocket knife too, Heidi.
And a pocket knife, I guess, but clearly not recently, because it was stuck in my suitcase. So, but yeah, so they stay on scene somewhat for protection. And if we need them, but for the most part, that's taking up manpower. So, like that person is sticking with us for however long it takes us to do our scene, while there's other calls holding for service that they could be doing. So when it is a civilian, obviously it can be a little bit more specialized, because they can only focus on forensics rather than worrying about both sides. But it does kind of, and I think it depends on the agency too. Like bigger agencies typically have both, and sometimes smaller agencies is where you see that kind of cross training there. We have a cousin that is up in Chicago, and he's a forensic deputy, and it's a very small town, like outside of Chicago, and I think they service 22,000 people. They have like 40 deputies, I think, and he just says it's not financially like viable for them to have a specific civilian forensic unit. So they have a couple guys. I think like a third of their deputies are forensic deputies. They handle the routine calls for service. And then on homicides, they actually have a task force among the surrounding cities. And when they have a homicide, they just kind of take from the task force, and then they'll go ahead and work that, which I thought was really interesting.
That is very interesting. And it helps with the manpower issues, which we'll get into a little bit of the hours and so forth that are tied up on some of those things when we get to your dissertation.
Yeah.
Just kind of a segue into that. You mentioned, well, most people's ideas of forensics comes from, of course, television shows. So it's CSI, it's, these shows we grew up watching, and that's exactly, and that's what they get this mindset from, and that's what they think. Can you maybe dispel a few of those misconceptions? And maybe
absolutely. So both when I was working in the field and now in the field of academia, I still get students that are like, well, I thought you could do this. And I'm like, you saw that on CSI season 3, episode 1. Like, I know that's not real. But yeah, so a common misconception I think would be the speed at which things happen. I've actually been on a scene before where I've recovered fingerprints, and I may have went back to the van for more supplies, to get a drink, whatever it may be. And I come back and they legitimately want to know if the fingerprints match to who they thought they would be. And there's just a huge disconnect there, because I know on TV, like in their vehicles, they're running things on their computer, and it's like spinning, and then it says match, match, match. And that's not the way it works. Like, I don't think people realize that, when we recover a fingerprint on scene, I'm not a latent print examiner. So yes, I can tell that this is a print of value. I can tell there's a good fingerprint. I can classify it in a minor capacity. But when I'm done, I bring it back to the office, I submit it as evidence, and then that goes to the latent print unit. And they are trained to look at all the minutia, or the little tiny, it's like a little tiny blueprint that they're looking at, and all the unique characteristics that makes it unique and individualized to a person. So they're looking at that. They're going to document areas of interest that are unique, and then they will run it through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system. And what AFIS does is it doesn't shoot out match, match, match. This is it. It gives them the top 10, if there are 10, sometimes 15, sometimes 5, the top matches of what is closest to what they just put in. And then what they do is they print out those, and then they manually look at them. So it's not solely just the computer. They actually they have a list of 10 that they then have to go through. What makes it easier on them is elimination prints, which, to be fully transparent and honest, is really a pain in the butt. I'm sure deputies agree.
Yes.
Yeah, I hate them just as much as another person, right? And that, anytime the deputy's like, oh, I'm like, I'm with you because I hate it too. They actually do make their job a lot easier, because then I can turn in the prints and be like, hey, here's the victim's prints on scene. Like, before you waste your time waiting for APHIS, that could come back to the victim, go ahead and check them, and then we know, right? Because if this print that I recovered matches the right thumb of the victim, okay, well, then that's a wash. We don't need to put in APHIS. We know whose it is. We know it's not the suspect. So that really does help them, but that's a common misconception. I think a lot of, even though TV shows use real processing techniques, like, this is my favorite example to give. So CSI Las Vegas, which is the best CSI, but so they use ninhydrin on one of their scenes, which is a real processing technique. It's a fingerprint technique that's used on porous surfaces, typically paper is what we use it on. It turns fingerprints purple. But on this episode, they sprayed it on a pillowcase to reveal hidden writing. And that's not a thing. So nope. So I mean, I guess unless even a pillowcase is pretty porous. So I really don't know how well that would work. But unless someone is like writing it out with their hand and they're like super oily, I still don't think that would be legit. And when they sprayed it, it looked like it was written in pen. Like, that's not real. And another huge thing, and people ask me all the time, so, I've had like a detective ask me it every once in a while, is the magic light that finds blood. And that's not real. So, what they're typically referring to is an alternate light source, which is typically used to find bodily fluids, and it can detect blood, but blood will not fluoresce or glow under an ALS. It actually turns black. So, although yes, if I shine it on something that's maybe has a pattern or something, and I get a dark spot, okay, I might use an IR camera or an infrared camera, because that is going to show blood a lot better. It's going to almost invert it to wash out the background and make that blood darker and more visible as a stain. If I'm shining the ALS and I see something that looks a little peculiar and it gets darker rather than lighter, then I may say, hey, like, let me go get the IR camera or infrared camera and take a look at this a little bit further. But on TV shows, a lot of the time they'll shine the ALS, and typically they're shining a blue light wearing no goggles, which you won't see anything. So you have to have some kind of barrier to balance out that blue light. You have to have orange filtered goggles in order to see anything. It doesn't matter what it is. If not, you're literally just going to be looking at a blue light shining. So they see it, and then the blood, and then the blood luminesces, and that's not a thing. The only way blood is going to luminesce is if you use something called luminol, which it reacts with the hemoglobin, and then it's going to cause chemiluminescence. And that's getting really scientific. But that's probably the main thing that really irks me about TV shows is the blood glowing light, and the process of fingerprints is probably what drives me crazy. And then of course there's the CSI effect, which because of TV shows on jurors, they expect us to have this huge like smoking gun evidence. And as you know, it's not always like that. A lot of times it's just little tiny pieces that kind of mold the case or put that puzzle together. It's not one big piece of evidence like, oh, I got the bloody fingerprint on the gun. Like typically that's not the way that works. Like that would be awesome.
We love it when it does.
Yeah, like I would love if every case was like that, but typically it's not. It might be a hair here, or it might be a fingerprint on this, or a trace of blood here. It's not that like, hey jury, look what I found. Like it's not like that, unfortunately. And I think because of TV, now jurors think that, and because you have to remember, jurors are just random people in society, right? Like they don't have any forensic training or law enforcement training. They don't know what they're looking at. A lot of times, and I'm sure you've been there too, where you're on the stand and you have to explain what something even is before you can even testify about it, right? Like, I'm talking about chemiluminescence and luminol, and they're like, I've never heard about that. So I have to just give a definition before I can talk about it. So they're getting a crash course in something, we've been doing or going to school for forever. So for them to fully conceptualize what specific evidence means, there's obvious issues there, but so they're looking for something that's like, boom, right in their face. And even though the small things to us are awesome, they're like, okay, cool. Like you found a hair, So I think that's a big issue too, that we see is in the courtroom for sure.
Yeah. I absolutely, and we see it as well, even on the patrol side. And
Yeah.
I know that's one of the things that I actually loved about economic crimes, because I know everyone's like, what do you like about economic? It's
Yeah.
boring newspaper and stuff. Unlike crimes against persons that can be
Mhm.
fairly subjective evidence, not necessarily subjective, but minimal evidence that you have when you go to trial. In economic crimes, there's usually copious amounts of evidence that I can bring. It's
Yeah.
just took me 3 years to get it all.
Mhm.
So, but that's what I loved about economic crimes, is because of the amount of evidence when you sit before a jury. If
Yeah.
that case even went to trial, a lot of times it doesn't even go to trial because you've got so much evidence that they end up pleading out on it
Yeah.
anyway.
But it's also knowing that you could go into court and do like a mic drop, right? Like you have all this evidence and you're like,
Right.
fight me on it, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, you have all your 3 ring binders. Like, okay, let's talk about this if
Yep.
you want.
No,
So
and I honestly agree with you as far as like the subjective evidence, because it really is like, as you know, obviously like I love forensic science and it's been like my whole life, but a lot of people forget that up until maybe like 15 years ago, it was junk science. Like it really just recently like gained its momentum on being really like concrete. And maybe 15 is like too narrow. Maybe okay, like 30 years, 20 years ago, it was like
right.
losing its title as junk science and becoming a real credible science. So, and even within forensic science, there's still things that are trying to gain credibility, like human remains detection dogs. Those are contested all the time. A big thanks to the Casey Anthony trial, which is a big reason why they're contested all the time. But like the reliability of that blood stain pattern analysis is one that is always fought in court, and so even facets within forensic science is still being contested. And I think a lot of that is to the subjectivity of evidence, right?
Right.
Because we govern what we do based on what's called the cards exchange principle, which is every contact leaves a trace, which is great, right? Like I'm in a crime scene, I'm like, oh, suspect touch here, there's probably DNA or a fingerprint, but that also can work in their favor. So, if Austin commits a crime, and he is wearing my sweatshirt, which would be weird, and then my DNA is
Yes.
on that, and then that gets transferred to the crime scene, it's going to look like I was there, even though I've never been there. So it is very subjective. I feel like there's a way to fight anything. I mean, fingerprints are definitely more concrete because it's not my fingers like jumped off my hands and ran somewhere.
Right.
But as far as DNA is very subjective. I feel like even more than a lot of people think about. So I think that's what makes it really hard to take forensic science and forensic evidence to court, is because it can be argued so easily. And
Right.
people come out and they're angry when things when people don't get convicted or cases don't go the way that they should, which I'm the first one to be angry, because especially when I just work so hard on a case. But
Right.
it's because the evidence can be so subjective and interpreted so many different ways, and I feel like there can be an excuse for a lot of different things, unfortunately.
Right. And it's frustrating. I mean, I know from this perspective, from our
Mhm.
perspective in this career field, it can be very frustrating. But then on the other side, it's the system working exactly the way it is. So
Mhm.
if Lord forbid I was in that position, I'm glad the system's working the way it is. So
Exactly. Yep.
that's the beauty
No,
of it.
I 100% agree with that for sure.
So let's, at some point here, because you weren't busy enough between being a mother and
Yeah,
working in forensics and so forth, you decided to also get your doctorate.
I did. Yep.
So, as part of that was a dissertation that you wrote, which is actually why you and I began speaking again via LinkedIn to kind of have this meeting. So, walk us into, first of all, maybe the desire to go down that road and to move towards academia, and then what you decided to write about.
Okay, yeah. So I have always known that I wanted to get a PhD. Honestly, since I was like 9 years old, it was just something I wanted to do. I've always kind of been a go big or go home type person. I'm very competitive, which I know that doesn't really relate to academia, but it just in my life, if there's a top tier, like I have to go for it. So just knowing that, I could get a PhD, I have to do it. So that's just like just who I am as a person, my personality. And I love to write and I love to research. So I knew that would give me an opportunity to be able to do that both in school and once I graduate to do my own research independently. So that was something I was really passionate about doing. But I knew before I started the process, I wanted to have a good topic in mind, because I talked to a lot of people regarding, what is in this program of a PhD, right? Like, what do I need to be prepared for? And the two main things that they told me were the comprehensive exam, which I pray for anyone that has to do that, because it is a pain.
Okay.
It's 3 questions. Each answer has to be a minimum of 15 pages, and you have 3 weeks to write it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have to write the 45-page paper before you get to write the 94-page paper. But so comprehensive exam was one thing that people really pushed onto me. And the second was being prepared to have your topic ripped apart. So I was like, nope, I'm going in with a solid topic before I even start coursework, right? And it's a good like little over 2 years before you even get to that part of being able to talk about what you want as a topic and stuff. So I was like, nope, I'm going to really do it on something I'm passionate about and I'm not going to get bored with, because that's another thing too, is everyone said, if you just pick a topic, you're going to get bored and you're not going to be motivated to want to do it.
Right.
So I was like, well, even though no one's dissertation changes the world, that was like a big thing that they pushed. No one's dissertation changes the world, and the best dissertation is a done dissertation. I was like, but still, I want to come out with something that is worthwhile and can help the people that I work with right now, right? So even though, I don't expect it to be published in any kind of, it is published, but I don't expect it to be plastered anywhere. But if that information can help the people that I know that work in this field, it's just a stepping stone towards the right direction. So, in forensics, I feel like you go in waves of stress and burnout. Surprisingly early, I feel like, in the career than other careers, even in even on the road, even in law enforcement. I feel like I saw burnout in forensic investigators much quicker than I saw it in deputies or really any other career field. And I really wanted to know why that was. And I honestly didn't know if it was burnout or if it was traumatization or what it was. I just knew it was stress. Like I knew people were really stressed and I wanted to know what was the root cause. Is it burnout and is it traumatization? So I started doing some digging and kind of doing research on my own and looking at research that's out there. And shocker, there's not a lot of research on stress and forensic investigators. I think it's because it is kind of like that forgotten profession, because we are support services. The majority of stress research in the field of law enforcement is on law enforcement. Right. So, they want to look at suicide among officers. They want to look at stress among officers, burnout, traumatization, when they go to crime scenes, stress related to life-saving efforts, everything like that. Or like the perception of the public on law enforcement. So that's a big thing that they look at too. So everything I found was focused on law enforcement. But the things that I did find on forensic investigators were kind of segmented as either trauma or burnout. There was no comparison between the two. And it seemed like there was a lot of missing links on both of them. So whether it was on trauma or whether it was on burnout, I felt like something was just missing. And I felt like some of that was comparing them, right? And really trying to figure out in this specific person, because obviously there's not the same sampling pool for both. So is it trauma or is it burnout, or is it trauma or is it burnout in these individuals? So that's kind of where I developed that. And it, there was some tweaking throughout my process, but for the most part, I was able to stick with the same topic that I chose when I went into it. And I think that was due to doing like a little bit of research before, because some of the people in my cohort, bless their heart, they changed their topic 3 times. It was a lot. So, and I knew it was something I could freely and openly talk about without having to be like, hold on, let me look, because I had that insider kind of information.
Right.
So that's kind of how I came to that topic, really, is just from being in the field and just wanting to know, like, why is there so much turnover? And it's not just at the agency I was at. I feel like agencies everywhere. The forensics is always constantly like a revolving door everywhere. And I just wanted to know why that was. And for those that do stay a long time in forensics, why they're staying and why other people aren't. So that was something that I really kind of wanted to like figure out too.
Okay, that's a great question as well. And you mentioned that the seeing traumatization and lacks focus on pressures of workload, deadline, support issues, routine exposure to scenes, legal pressures, etc. So pretty much it was looking at the entire picture of what a forensic investigator has to deal with, and how that segues. So let me ask you, what did you kind of find out? Where'd your research take you as you started writing this?
So my research took me a lot of different places. So I figured out that there needed to be this kind of comparison between the two. And then I realized that, so I chose my instruments, right? I chose the Maslow burnout inventory to study burnout, and I chose the impact of event scale to study trauma. And as I was writing and doing my research, I realized, oh crap, the Maslow burnout inventory actually has 3 separate subscales. Of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment, which means my 2 multiple regression analyses just turned into 5. So
lucky you.
Yeah, I was super pumped about it. So then, the first part is assigning your sampling pool, right? So that was a little bit difficult as well because there's a wide range of forensic investigators, right? There's ones that have been doing it forever, ones that are brand new, and I knew that I was going to look at just homicide and attempted homicide investigations because, like you said, they were looking at everything in other studies, and I knew I didn't want to look at everything because I felt like that was too cloudy and it kind of just like mucked it up in a sense, right? And it was just too hard to really decipher and pinpoint the aspect of stress. So I was like, this has never been done looking at a specific crime type. So let's just look at homicides and attempted homicides because the only difference between the two is a dead body, right? And I feel like I've seen a lot of attempted homicides that are just as traumatic, if not more, than an actual homicide. So, so I combined the two. And I decided that it should be forensic investigators with at least 1 year because that gave them ample time to be able to investigate things like that. They have to investigate those kind of crimes because there are agencies that only do property crimes and they kind of parcel out their violent crimes to other bigger agencies. And then I had to eliminate the agency I worked at. So nobody that worked there could take my survey. And that was just really for ethical considerations. So no one felt pressured really.
Right.
And then from there, once everything kind of went in, I found a lot of different things because I had a lot of different variables, honestly. So first starting with the overall burnout, right? Which is, I feel like what everyone really wants to know. There was actually negative correlation between the overall burnout score or the total score that they reported of their level of burnout and their perceived sense of support. And basically what that means with a negative correlation is the higher their sense of support, the lower their burnout score was. So people that reported a higher level of support had lower burnout. So to us, that basically just tells us that, if there's support both within the workplace and outside of work, they're gonna have less burnout overall. So typically, and then I compared those with the length of career. And there was also a relationship between those that had a longer length of career, higher support levels, and lower burnout. So that kind of just speaks to that's why those people are lasting so long, is because they have more support in the workplace, outside of the workplace, and as a result, aren't feeling as burnout.
Right.
Emotional exhaustion, which was also one of the subscales of burnout, there was actually no significance or relationships between any of the variables and emotional exhaustion. I was a little surprised by that, but it is what it is. Sometimes you just don't find anything. And that was the same with depersonalization too. Lower support did have a little bit of a significance in relationship with depersonalization, but not enough to make it statistically significant, right? So it kind of like was a blip on my radar, but not enough to actually factor in as a variable that had any kind of moderating factor. So that basically told me that lower support scores predicted higher levels of depersonalization, and they kind of define depersonalization also as like cynicism or having that negative, cynical attitude, which I could see. If you don't have a lot of support in the workplace, you're going to be a little cynical towards the workplace, the people you work with, life. So that was one that didn't quite make the tier there, but it was still important to notate that, I feel like a lot of times in the workplace, they focus on morale, right? They want to know, why is morale bad? Why is morale bad? And I feel like having that higher sense of support would cause that cynicism to lower and therefore have a better morale.
When you talk about support, was it solely administrative type support, or was it a blend of administrative as well as the team and the lower level leaders as well?
It was a blend. Yeah. So I use what's called the perceived supervisor support scale. But one thing with research, which is great, is you can use those scales, but you can kind of tweak them, right, to what you're trying to get at. Because, obviously there's not a specific scale on stress within forensic investigation and homicides, right? So you kind of have to tweak it the way you want it to be. So with that one, the instructions, I just tweaked them to be, because it was a Likert scale, I think 1 through 7 for 3 items. And it was, read the following and determine your level of support among your supervisors, administration, and your coworkers. So that way it was their overall sense of support.
Right.
And that was one thing I kind of identified too, was maybe looking at in, recommendations for further research, looking at, maybe we should parcel out where that support's coming from. Is support from your coworkers who are at an equal level to you more important than your supervisor, or is the supervisor support more important than your coworkers, right? Or is it none of those, and is it having that upper echelon support from like a chief or a captain or a lieutenant more important to your success and your outlook on the unit than those who may be at an equal level than you? So that was
That would
something.
be an interesting study. Anecdotally, I would be curious as to what that outcome would be.
Yeah, I know. I joke to everyone that they were like, well, what did you figure out was the most beneficial part of your dissertation? And I was like, all the things that I should research on in the future. Like it was all the things that I should do next, because obviously you can't do everything right in your dissertation. But I was surprised at how many things I found that I want to do later on.
I see a book in your future, or several
Yeah,
books
I
in
would
your
love
future.
to.
You're going to have to.
For sure. So personal accomplishment was one of the more interesting ones because that gave me two different correlations here. So there was a positive correlation between the time spent on scenes and the personal accomplishment score. So basically, which is kind of unique, but the longer they spent on crime scenes, the more accomplished they felt. Which I thought was interesting, and I don't know if that's because they're putting in so much work to these investigations, and I can kind of resonate to that because if I spent 3 days on a homicide, I would feel pretty accomplished, like I did a really good job. But that does kind of relate to the type of homicide, right? Because, a bloodbath may take you 3 days, whereas just someone being shot outside in the grass is going to take you like 3 hours, So like, It really speaks to the type there, but that was interesting that the more time they spend on scene, the more they feel personally accomplished. And then there was also a negative correlation between their court anxiety and the personal accomplishment score. So as their court anxiety rose, right? So those that maybe reported like a 7, 8, or 9 court anxiety level had lower personal accomplishment, which does make sense, right? You probably don't have a lot of confidence if you're going into court that nervous, and vice versa, where if they had low court anxiety, they have a high level of personal accomplishment because they feel confident in what they did. And typically, I saw that a lot in the newer investigators. So those that reported, 1 or 2 years on the job had higher court anxiety and lower levels of personal accomplishment. And those that had been, really my cutoff was like 3 years, like 3 years or more, I found lower court anxiety levels just because they're really more in the routine of things. And it also related to how many homicides they work a year. Those that worked 1 a year obviously had much more court anxiety than those that work 10 a year, right? Or 15 or however many it may be. Yeah, so traumatization gave me no findings. There was no relationships between length of career, the time spent on scene, the amount of homicides they work per year, social support, or court anxiety related to traumatization whatsoever, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really interesting. And I kind of chalked that up a little bit to the fact that so the average years of service was 13 in my study. So for the majority of people in my study had a pretty, lengthy career already in forensics. And the average number of homicides was 15 from my study. So, which is a pretty fair amount. That's more than one a month, right? And depending on how many days it takes you, plus doing all the evidence. I kind of concluded that maybe they were just accustomed to that lifestyle because they've been doing it for so long. So, seeing dead bodies on a routine basis, seeing trauma, seeing things like that, whether it be kids, adults, whatever, I kind of chalked it up to because the length of time is that long and they do it so frequently that they're just so accustomed to it, whereas a little bit higher trauma scores were found in people that had pretty newer careers, like a year to 2 years, because it was still new to them, especially if they hadn't had any kind of experience of that before, which was another thing I would like to look into is what was their experience beforehand, right? Do they have any military experience? Were they a law enforcement officer? Were they a medic? Did they do something where they saw dead bodies on a routine basis? And then I think that would speak to why they would maybe not feel traumatized, or if they were just fully aware of what they were getting into before they came into the field.
Right. Yeah, that would be an interesting one as well, because I do think now, for me, from the law enforcement perspective, I actually credit some of the way I look at scenes and the fact that I had no prior experience of any kind. Mm-hmm. In fact, I did landscaping. I put plants in the ground, green side up. So that was completely different. So coming into this field, I actually kind of credit that as a positive because it just a little bit different mindset. So I'd be curious as well where that would lead.
Yep. Yeah. And I think some of it would speak to like schooling too, because, there's some people who have schooling that fully expose them to these things and, don't sugarcoat it at all. Like, hey, you're going to see people with their head blown off. And there's some that and I don't know if it's maybe instructors don't know depending on their experience, but I think some of it is just being fully aware of what you're going to get into. So I just found it interesting that it was really more burnout than anything else.
Yeah,
So,
very interesting. And again, anecdotally, I could see that being very much in line with what I would guess.
yep.
Let me ask, you mentioned early on this idea of perceived stress versus actual stress. Can you describe a little bit of that and where you're coming from there?
Yes. So, and what really that means is, so I'm not a psychologist, right? Like I'm nowhere qualified to gauge someone's level of stress. The instrument I used was based on their perceived level of stress. So they are reporting their own stress. And as we all know, there's things like denial, there's things like fabrication. Like the research is only as good as what they're going to tell me. Whereas actual stress can be measured by a psychologist or by actually being interviewed by someone. Which even then would take a more qualitative approach rather than a quantitative one. So that's really the difference there, is my study looked at perceived stress and perceived traumatization. So, and perceived burnout. So it's all their perception, because they're the ones filling out, their questionnaires. And it's not so much for forensics, but law enforcement in general, there is, a little bit in forensics, there's almost like this nuance of, you have to like be strong, you can't say things affect you, right? Like, we see a dead body and we're almost perceived as weak if we're like, hey, that really kind of messed with me, right? And that's naive, right? Like looking back on it now, and I was that way too when I first started. I was like, oh, I'm the new girl, like I can't act like things bother me. And looking back on it, I don't know if I just got like the bad luck of the draw, because I feel like out of anyone I knew that worked there, like I saw some of the worst stuff that came my way while I was there. So it's just naive to say that things don't affect you later on. But I feel like there is a little bit of a stigma there, that you can't say that you felt traumatized or you felt stressed from an event, or even that you need help sometimes. So
I think you're absolutely right. I think that I know that I've seen that on both sides of the house. And I think you pointed out in here, but there is a lot of people don't understand, like you state, however, in many cases, they serve in closer proximity for a more extended period of time than their first responding counterparts. People don't realize how long forensics remains on that scene. You touched on it a little bit, but it can be days depending on it can be weeks depending on the case, if it's a traumatic one involving multiple people, correct?
it can. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and Austin, my husband, used to be forensics and is now a deputy. So it's always interesting getting his take on it. As far as like, hey, because I'm a big proponent of like stress and like what are the little things that stress you out, aspects of the job. So, we have conversations all the time, like, now that both sides of it, what do you think is more traumatic for you? And he's like, I think it's more traumatic seeing someone like take their last breath, or giving CPR to someone who doesn't survive or something like that. He's like, but I think it is much more of a burnout factor when you have to stay on that scene for day after day after day, or hour after hour after hour, looking at that person who has like their eyes gouged out. He's like, I think he's like, although yes, that is traumatic, looking at this person for that long of a time period. And he's like, but I think it's more of a burnout, that you're looking at this over and over and over. He's like, it's literally like a Criminal Minds episode that won't end, which it is. Like, you're just sitting there and you're staring at this person and you're like, when is the medical examiner come to get them? So, and he's like, and even once they're gone, like, you're still looking at all the work you have to do. You're looking at all the blood spatter on the walls. You're looking at all the trajectory you have to do, or all the geomapping, or whatever it may be. Like, you're looking at all the work you have to do. So, yeah. So he's like, as a deputy on most crime scenes, I show up, okay, there's a dead body. Okay, let's call forensics. Okay, I'm going to sit out in my car, and like do my report, do the crime scene log. He's like, so that is like not traumatic or really a burnout for me at all. He's like, but when I was on the other side as forensics, like we show up and we are like, I've been there weeks working on a case. I've worked on a case that, especially with the dog, like day after day after day, week into months. And, you're just still working on this case, and, you might not be yielding any results, or you're just doing the same monotonous thing over and over. And it gets you with little to no sleep. One of the worst calls I worked, worked 22 hours, went home, slept for a couple hours, and came back for another 16 hours, and just kept doing that until we were done. So I think it is something that people forget about, that we do show up and we're there for a long time compared to deputies, but not to discredit deputies. They do what we can even think of doing. So they actually have to sometimes see people take their last breath, or, be begging for help and not be able to get it. So it's just stress in a different way. And that's what I kind of try and throw out there. Some people ask me like, well, it feels like you're, saying that they shouldn't say that they're stressed. And that's not it at all. It's different stress. And unfortunately, just forensics doesn't have the attention as law enforcement, which understandable, because you guys are the first responders and we're support services. But it's just different types of stress. And I feel like the only way to reduce that amount of burnout and stuff, but that rotating door of positions is to address why it's happening. And I think a lot of it has to do with people becoming burnt out. And I know there's like a whole chapter or section in there about recommendations, but it's just like the forgotten profession sometimes. So that's why I get
Yeah.
all jazzed about it.
It can feel that way, I'm sure. And on the time perception, I mean, that goes all the way back to our earlier conversation on CSI and these other
Mhm.
shows. Cause, you know, even like a Law and Order episode, we figure out who the bad guy is, we take him to trial, and we conclude this whole thing in 1 hour.
Yeah.
And we all know that that is so far from it. And I think even the general public knows that's not realistic, but
Mhm.
it's just the way we are in our society where things happen so fast. And yet these are like kind of the opposite of that, because there's so many checks and balances and so many things that need to be done.
Oh,
It's a very
absolutely.
long process that can wear on the investigators.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still getting tracked down for subpoenas for cases I did in 2016.
Yep.
And now court is basically shut down for at least for big trials for a while now because of COVID. So, I'm looking in 2021 to go to a case from 2016, if even then. So from start to finish, it does take a lot longer than I think people realize. And there's just a lot more to do than what they show on TV. Like, especially when you get into something more sophisticated, like blood stain pattern analysis and stuff like that. It's not like a quick, oh, I'll be done in an hour. Like it days, to really
Right.
document it the right way. So that's just something I agree that people don't take into consideration.
Since we're getting a little short on time here, let me just ask you, summarizing, because we could go on for quite a while. It was really well written, and I am
Thank
serious. I'm hoping it leads to some books and some more information, because I think it's very needed. But just what is one thing that we can give people as far as like a conclusionary that the research gives you? Because it sounds to me like support may be that key, but what would you say that is? That one
Honestly, I
thing?
just think it kind of just goes back to like things like, like your mama used to teach you back in the day, like just be kind to one another. And when you see someone struggling, like don't feel like you are too big of a person to lend a helping hand, right? And I know sometimes it's hard, especially in law enforcement. And like law enforcement officers get stripes, but forensic investigators, like really all we have to count on is our FI number or our seniority, right? So it doesn't matter if you're FI1, FI2, FI3, and there's FI13 and they're struggling. Like you're never too good to help somebody else, and just doing their evidence labels or filling out their property voucher or helping them like transport things from their van into the office. You never know the impact that could have, and you never know how stressed they are feeling, because again, people don't show it. No one is going to say, hey, I'm really stressed, hey, I'm really burnt out, hey, I feel like I'm drowning in all this work that I have, like I really need some help. No one's going to say that, because forensics is a very independent field, that we could do everything ourselves and never have to rely on anybody, right? Like, I mean, if I had to, I could work a homicide all by myself and never need a helping hand. It doesn't mean you should, because that's where you get to that point of being burnout. I know
Right.
firsthand, but you just have to put yourself in those people's shoes, right? Because I know I have felt so severely burnout that I wanted to just cry and be like, okay, I'm done, I'm out, and if I feel like that, other people feel like that. So the biggest thing I can say is just be that helping hand to people that don't have a helping hand, right? If you're sitting there doing nothing and someone's in the evidence room and they have 100 something items of evidence, and they've been inundated with calls, go help them. All you have to do is type something out or write on bags. Like it takes just a little tiny minute amount of time to save someone's career from them feeling burnt out and calling it quits.
Right.
Is really
Yeah,
the most.
that's powerful, powerful stuff, and great advice. And I think no matter what side of the house you're on, be it in the law enforcement, forensics, or a blend of the two, that's really exactly what we need to do for all of our brothers and sisters out there.
I agree. For
Heidi,
sure.
thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming on. How can people connect with you?
They can connect with me best through email, hsievers, HSIEVERS @kaiseruniversity.edu. I'm sure you'll probably put that in somewhere.
I will.
But yeah, so that's the best way to connect with me. Um, and I hope someone does. I love talking about this kind of stuff. So
I absolutely will. Be sure to link that up in the show notes. And I definitely encourage listeners to look more into this, especially if they have an interest in getting into forensics or into the law enforcement field, because it's so important. So thank you so much, Heidi, for coming on.
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.